Chapter 1171, His Own Designed Shadow Slave. Indeed, the treasure Nightstad had discovered in the desert was a citadel. Not the tomb of Ariel itself, of course. No scout had managed to get anywhere near the Black Pyramid, yet. It just always loomed far in the distance, never getting closer, like an ominous mirage. But he did find a citadel. At this point, both Valor and Song were scouting the outer reaches of the desert in search of a suitable position to establish a base camp. Once they found one, numerous soldiers would be brought there through the corresponding nightmare gates, and the expeditions toward the pyramid would be launched. However, a citadel had the potential to drastically change the balance of power between the two great clans in their pursuit of the demon's tomb. The clan that possessed one would hold an overwhelming advantage. The clan that did not would fall behind before the race even started. A citadel was not only better fortified and safer than a makeshift stronghold. Connected to the waking world by a gateway, it would make it much easier to ferry awakened into the dream realm, transport supplies, and establish logistical chains. Some regions of the dream realm held only one citadel, while some held many. At this point, it was unknown if Nightstad's discovery was the only citadel in the White Desert, except for the tomb of Ariel itself, but even if Song were to eventually discover a second one, the delay would put them at a great disadvantage. So, needless to say, taking the citadel was of paramount importance. However, it was guarded by a fearsome nightmare creature. More than that, even though Valor put a lot of effort into keeping Stad's prize a secret, there was no guarantee that Song would not try to take it by force eventually. So, Warren and his people were dispatched into the desert as the first wave of reinforcements. Their task was to assist the fearsome knight in conquering the citadel and lay the groundwork for the arrival of further forces. Of course, there was a problem with that plan. The fact that an insidious creature had long taken the place of Squire Warren and came to the desert in his place. Valor. Mordred let out a fierce battle cry as he led his people into the tide of nightmare creatures. The citadel was right in front of them. It was not a fortress, nor was it a pyramid built of black stone. In fact, it was not a man-made structure at all. Instead, it was a gargantuan black skull that towered above the white dunes, staring at the azure sky with the dark pits of its empty eye sockets. There were 3 of them, 2 where a human's eyes would be, and the third one above them, right in the middle of the skull's vast forehead. Each of the empty eye sockets was the side of a stadium, and currently, a flood of revolting nightmare creatures was flowing out of them onto the white sand. Hold fast. Roaring such stupid things, Mordred plunged into the mass of abominations. His sword rose and fell, cutting them down, and his shield rang under a barrage of attacks. How tedious. He felt slightly frustrated by the need to hold himself back. Mordred could not unleash his power as a master, but even more disheartening than that, he had to imitate the combat skills of the long-dead Warren. As a retainer of the great clan Valor, Warren had been at the pinnacle of what awakened warriors strive to be. And yet, to Mordred, that level of skill was dull and suffocating. Limiting himself to such a mediocre level of mastery was harder than surviving in the tide of nightmare creatures. He endured the frustrating limitations and fought, struggling to keep his body intact. Sadly, Warren had been a heroic type, as well, so to play his role faithfully, Mordred had to act accordingly. He did not hesitate to put himself in danger's way to protect his soldiers, risking life and limb to make sure that all of his companions survived. Stay strong, Vero. Agath, back. Lean on me, Crass. His companions seemed empowered with him by their side. It was strange. Mordred was leading soldiers of Valor into battle, all of them connected by a shared sense of duty, belonging, and devotion. They spilled the blood of nightmare creatures and fought with valiant resolve, refusing to give ground. Wasn't that what he was supposed to become, if things had been different? Wasn't leading the brave warriors of Valor the fate that had been stolen from him? Ah! Such irony. After an eternity of blood and agonizing heat, the battle was over. The nightmare creatures were dead. The tyrant that had made the citadel its lair had been slain by Nightstad himself. The awakened, both those brought to the desert by Mordred and those that belonged to Stad's personal elite unit, were mostly alive, and victorious. They had won. Now, all they had to do was reap the spoils of their triumph. The crowd of mighty awakened warriors cleaned their blades and dove into the cool darkness of the ancient skull. They carefully made their way to the heart of the citadel, where, in a vast chamber of black bone, the gateway awaited to be activated. Nightstad was the first to see it. Bright sunlight spilled through a jagged crack in the chamber's roof, and, thrust into the bone floor, a gargantuan arrowhead of lustrous steel shone with reflected radiance. A triumphant smile appeared on the knight's face. Turning around, he placed his heavy hand on Mordred's shoulder. "You did well, Warren. Glory and valor." Mordred smiled pleasantly. Everything was going according to plan. Now, his task was simple: remain in the good graces of Sir Stad, anchor himself to the gateway, return to the waking world, and inform Clan Song about the location of the citadel. Then, when Valor properly established themselves here and concentrated their forces in one place, he would help Seishan and the rest stage an unexpected attack and rip the citadel from his clan's hands while decimating its defenders. However, that was Clan Song's plan. Mordred, on the other hand, had his own designs. In his opinion, the emissaries of the Queen of Worms had allowed themselves to commit a grave sin. They had grown arrogant. Drunk on the succession of easy victories and their outward superiority in terms of numbers, they had foolishly come to underestimate his family. Wasn't it the epitome of being misguided? To look down on the descendants of war while waging one. Seishan and Beastmaster might have been blinded by the feeling of complacency his sister had so masterfully lured them into, but Mordred knew better. It didn't matter who had reaped a few victories at the start. All that mattered was who would be left standing at the finish. Clan Song seemed to be holding an advantage for now, but the walls of the trap were already closing in around them. Mordred did not know what the trap was, but he did know one thing: the more time Morgan was given, the more devastating her retaliation would be. So, to destroy her plans, he had to throw the cadence of this conflict into utter chaos. Looking at Nightstad with a pleasant smile, Mordred nodded. Glory and valor. With that, he plunged his sword into the ascended warrior's neck. Stad's eyes widened, and, as blood poured out of his mouth, Mordred moved his blade sideways, almost decapitating the ascended. Just like that, the fearsome Knight of Valor died, killed by the treacherous attack of an ally. All around him, the awakened froze, paralyzed by shock. Crass shivered. Wah. Warren, what? Ripping his sword out of Stad's neck, Mordred delivered a downward cut in one swift, fluid motion. The blade fell on Crass' head, splitting his skull and obliterating his face. The awakened was dead long before the Ascended's body fell to the floor. The rest of them were utterly stunned. However, they weren't the elites of a great clan for nothing. Despite the harrowing wrongness of what had happened, his companions, who were the closest ones to the bloody scene, reacted just a split second later. Both Vero and Agath moved, raising their swords to attack their friend and commander, who had seemingly gone mad. Mordred tried to parry both strikes, but failed. Vero's sword pierced his throat. Pushing Warren down, the petrified awakened stared at his dead eyes and screamed. How can? Beastmaster, that witch. She must have forced him. Behind him, Agath remained silent for a moment, looking down. Her body trembled slightly. Vero turned around, staring at his comrade with crazed eyes. Agath raised her head and glanced at him with a pleasant smile. Really, now? Must you compare me to that terrible woman? Her rapier shot forward. Soon, the gargantuan black skull was filled with screams, terror, and the stench of human blood. The nightmare creatures were dead. The awakened were dead, too. Only Mordred remained. Chapter 1172, Fine Facade. Sunny stared at the silhouette of a departing battleship, deep in thought. October was now behind them, and November was in full bloom. Well. Not that many things ever bloomed in Antarctica. It was still summer here, the day never ended, and although the weather was chilly, it could not even be called cold. The evacuation continued at a steady pace. Hundreds of millions of refugees had already been carried across the ocean, and millions more were leaving every week. The situation on the continent was dire, but also strangely manageable. The chain of nightmare was escalating without end. There were more nightmare gates, more abominations, more threats and problems that had to be solved. But, at the same time, the forces of humanity were also growing stronger. Despite the losses they suffered and the increasing strain on logistics and supplies, they were becoming more steadfast and efficient in dealing with the endless tide of nightmare creatures. Well, it was not that surprising, really. The greatest strength of humans was their adaptability. They were masters of absorbing and utilizing information. They learned. At the start of the Antarctica campaign, the evacuation army had been thrust into a new and seemingly impossible situation. Faced with an unprecedented cataclysm, they suffered bitter defeats. And yet, they endured. Then, slowly, they learned how to deal with the enemy better. Their tactics and strategy improved. Their well of knowledge about the types of abominations coming through the gates grew deeper. The inexperienced soldiers became grizzled veterans. It helped that there were countless soul shards to be harvested, as well. Although Sunny was somewhat sad that the price of the shards on the global marker was going to plummet, cutting off one of the major revenue streams for the brilliant Emporium, he was also glad. By now, most awakened soldiers of the evacuation army had ample chances to saturate their soul cores, thus vastly elevating their power. Something like that had probably never happened in history, at least not on that scale. There were plenty of memories and echoes to go around, too. There were also more and more sleepers who had survived their first nightmares. There were so many, in fact, that the approaching winter solstice would most likely become a breaking point in the entire campaign. In a matter of weeks after that fateful day, the number of awakened in the evacuation army was going to tremendously swell, perhaps even double. In the meantime, though, in one of the 3 defensive sections of East Antarctica, government forces were stubbornly holding against the endless assaults of nightmare creatures under the leadership of Wake of Ruin. Effie and Kai were doing great for themselves. The Wolves and the Nightsingers, as well as their commanders, were known as the hammer and anvil of the evacuation army by now. Their fame and reputation were growing with each passing day. Even though each victory was made a little bitter by the casualties that the 2 companies suffered. In the second defensive section, Clan Song was quietly creating one miracle after another. Strangely enough, it was Saishan's name that was mentioned most often. The 3 saints might have had overwhelming battle power, but Saishan seemed to be the one actually managing the war effort. Jet periodically updated Sunny on what was happening in Song's territory, so while he did not know all the details, he at least knew that the situation there was mostly under control. And then there was the third defensive section, the one where the great clan Valor, and Sunny himself, were located. Things were manageable here, too. Morgan and Nephi's had become like 2 goddesses for the refugees crammed into the siege capitals. Their fame had outshone even that of the saints. 2 beautiful sisters, one wisely leading the soldiers from the back, the other never leaving the front lines. It was a compelling image. While forces of valor were strong enough to resist most attacks, it was Changing Star and her fire keepers that were always sent into the most dire and important battles. For now, they had not failed to secure a victory once. Their numbers had diminished a lot since their arrival to the southern quadrant, but not because of casualties. Instead, several cohorts of the fire keepers had already ventured into the seeds, aiming to become ascended. Unknown to most people, there was also a third pillar to the success of the Valor contingent. Cassie. While no one except for a select few knew of the importance of her role, the Quiet Oracle was indispensable in building the strategy of the defending forces. Her ability to gather and swiftly analyze information from a multitude of scattered sources, keen mind, and supernatural intuition were tools that allowed Morgan to drastically increase the efficiency and effectiveness of her command. Meanwhile, the House of Night was doing its part, as well. From rare messages sent by Neve, Sunny knew that the naval convoys traversing the oceans had faced many difficulties. There had been several tragedies, but overall, more and more refugees were reaching safety in the other 3 quadrants. So, the situation was dire, but things seemed to be going fine in Antarctica. Of course, Sunny knew that it was only a facade. Behind that facade, the bloody feud between Valor and Song was growing more and more violent, threatening to spill into utter disaster. The forward scouts of both great clans were hunting each other in the dream realm. Out here in the waking world, there were more and more ambushes and attempts at sabotage. Powerful awakened warriors were killed by other humans, instead of nightmare creatures. Most of it happened far away from the siege capitals, for now. And yet, Sunny had been pretty busy in the past few weeks. It was hard to do the things he wanted to do while remaining unnoticed, but he managed with the help of Shadow Step and Shadow Manifestation, somehow. He could traverse great distances swiftly at night while riding Nightmare. As such, his hunting grounds were not limited to a single siege capital. In fact, Sunny had made an effort to limit his activity to a minimum there, as well as in any area where he showed his face by following Morgan. He ambushed the ambushers. He assassinated the assassins. He killed members of both Valor and Song without distinction, leading both forces to believe that it was the enemy who had possessed hidden forces in the region. Sunny had struck several more times after the massacre at the underground factory. He had thought that it would make him feel good, but it didn't. The things he did were not pleasurable. There was a rush and a satisfaction of a clean kill, but at the same time, there was disgust and an overwhelming sense of what a waste this whole mad disaster was. It was just something that had to be done. And even then, as time passed, Sunny was starting to lose sight of why he was even doing these things. Was it all futile? It sure seemed that way. And so, every time he happened to be near a port fortress, Sunny liked to watch the ships depart. This, at least, was something obvious. A palpable result. With each vessel that sailed away, more refugees were taken away from this hell. He climbed the walls of the fortress to watch the ships leave today, too. This time, however, something felt different. It was as though a sudden tension permeated the air. Sunny sighed. He felt as if things were about to change. Chapter 1173, Red Herring. Sunny was watching the battleship move across the tumultuous surface of the ocean. But, of course, he was watching other things at the same time as well. His shadows were spread throughout the port fortress, absorbing all kinds of information. One was hidden in the barrel of an overheated rail gun, watching nightmare creatures laying siege to the walls of the stronghold. A deathly downpour of projectiles, both mundane and magical, was falling on the surging mass of attacking abominations. Figures of knights could be seen within the horde, moving to eliminate the most dangerous targets. St. Gilead was also there, clad in a suit of lustrous armor, facing the nightmare creatures like a bastion of immovable courage and steel. It was a familiar scene. Another shadow was with the refugees who were nervously waiting for their turn to board the ships. The sounds of the battle were too oppressive to talk freely, but they couldn't help but whisper, sharing their fears and hopes. Sunny listened carefully, assessing the changes in the mood of the civilians, as well as how they perceived the conflict. From time to time, he managed to learn something interesting from the rumors spreading among the refugees. A third shadow was with Nephi's, who had entered the field hospital beneath the fortress wall some time ago. She was kneeling in front of a bloodied stretcher, holding her hands above the terrible wounds covering the body of a mundane soldier. A soft radiance emanated from beneath her skin, and the wounds of the young men were swiftly closing. Her face was motionless and pale. There were many people behind her who had been in the throes of suffering not too long ago, but were now healthy and whole. They were looking at her with eyes in which indescribable relief mixed with awe and reverence in equal measure. The fourth shadow was with Sunny himself. And, of course, the fifth shadow was slowly making its way into the sealed chamber where Morgan had gone a dozen or so minutes ago. Usually, Sunny would not risk getting that close to the Princess of War when she really wanted to keep her conversations private. But today was a special day. It was not because the main force of Clan Valor had left their designated siege capitals and assembled in this pot fortress to give battle to a large horde of migrating nightmare creatures. Things like that happened from time to time, when it was more advantageous to deal with the threat sooner rather than later. No. It was because today, Saint Madoc had returned from his clandestine mission in the territory of Clan Song. To this day, Sunny was not sure whether Ascended Bast was truly the current vessel of Mordred, one of his reflections, or simply a diversion meant to sow confusion among his enemies. At times, Sunny had felt certain that the Bleakman was none other than the Prince of Nothing, but he still harbored some doubt. Whispering Blade was going to dispel his doubts once and for all. The shadow did not manage to enter the sealed room, doing so would have alerted Morgan about its presence, but it did manage to slither into a service duct running above it, and peek inside through the small gap in the ceiling insulation. Sunny frowned as he watched the ocean, noticing a disaffectionate expression on Saint Madoc's face. The fearsome transcendent was talking, his voice even, waiting for me. It was a trap from the very beginning. Which would not have been too inconvenient if Ascended Bast was, indeed, the abomination. However, he was not. I confirmed it. Morgan leaned back and sighed. Still. It couldn't be helped. We had to eliminate the possibility. She lingered for a few moments, then asked, how serious was the trap? A faint smile appeared on Saint Madoc's face. Throwing a quick glance at the young woman, he chuckled. You don't have to worry about this old man, Morgan. Silent Stalker and Dire Fong were there. I could not leave without saying a proper goodbye, though, so they'll have a few new scars to brag about. Many kilometers away, Sunny tilted his head a little. Such arrogance. However, was it really arrogance if Matic was powerful enough to back up his words, and lethal enough to make each of them count? Regardless of that, one question remained. If Ascended Bast had nothing to do with Mordred, then where the hell was that bastard, really? In the sealed room, Morgan echoed his thoughts. The situation is problematic, then. None of the divinations managed to pinpoint his location. Either Queen Key was generous enough to bestow that person with a truly powerful obscuring memory, or he has some means of avoiding our gaze of his own. It is strange, though. How could a mere master achieve such a thing? Matic frowned. We weren't able to confirm his ascended ability. Maybe it has something to do with that. You can't forget what rank his aspect is, Morgan. Not paying attention to a dark expression on his niece's face, Whispering Blade added, he might be closer than we think, too. These strange attacks we suffered recently, weren't our diviners strangely unable to ascertain anything about them? It can't be a coincidence. Morgan remained silent for a while, then shook her head. There is some correlation, but the pattern doesn't fit. More than that, the countermeasures we have in place to confirm the identities of our ascended showed no anomalies. We can't check every refugee, mundane soldier, and awakened, of course. Matic thought for a few moments. What about that government brute, Ascended Sunless? A slight smile appeared on Morgan's face. Who do you take me for? He was the first one I checked. We have studied him thoroughly after the Night Temple incident, as well. Ascended Sunless is certainly not ordinary, his SS designation, service record, and age should attest to that, but he is definitely himself, and not that abomination's vessel. Sunny frowned. Valor seemed to possess some kind of tool capable of determining whether one was possessed by Mordred or not, even if its function seemed to be limited to a small number of people. Nevertheless, he had been one of the people they checked. When the hell had that happened? He had not even noticed anything. Back in the sealed room, Morgan frowned. So where is the creature hiding? At that moment, the door suddenly opened, and someone walked inside. Both Morgan and Matic looked at the newcomer with surprise. Kasha. How bold of you, to come here without invitation. The Princess of War smiled dangerously. At the same time, Matic raised an eyebrow. You'd better have a good explanation for this interruption, young lady. Cassie lingered for a few moments, appearing somewhat nervous. Then, she said in a tense voice, there is a message for you. I think you should come outside.